The Journey to Exile, a Mobutu Sese Seko's Final Days, the tale of Mobutu Sese Seko, Zaire's longtime ruler, is one of grandeur, betrayal, and the painful irony of power. For 32 years, Mobutu stood at the helm of Zaire, a man wrapped in leopard-skin caps, wielding a cane topped with a golden eagle, and exuding an aura of unshakable confidence. To his supporters, he was a strong man who gave Zaire an identity. To his critics, he was the embodiment of corruption and repression, a dictator who built palaces in the jungle while his people lived in poverty. But history has a way of humbling even the most vainglorious of rulers. In 1997, after 3 decades of rule, Mobutu found himself fleeing his homeland under fire. His journey into exile was not merely the escape of a man, it was the collapse of an entire era. The fall of the leopard. Mobutu came to power in 1965 after orchestrating a coup that toppled a weak civilian government. He promised unity, order, and African authenticity. For years, he enjoyed immense support from Western powers, particularly the United States and France, who saw him as a bulwark against communism during the Cold War. Washington funneled millions into his regime, and not because of his democratic values, but because of his strategic importance in the heart of Africa. Yet, the same West that once embraced him as a friend would later turn its back on him. By the 1990s, the Cold War had ended, and Mobutu's value diminished. Without the excuse of communist containment, Western nations could no longer justify their support for a leader whose name had become synonymous with kleptocracy. As Mobutu's health declined, ravaged by prostate cancer, so did his grip on power. His once loyal army fractured, many switching sides as Laurent Desire Kabila's rebel forces advanced across the country. The leopard was losing its teeth, and his jungle kingdom was slipping away. The escape from Gbadolite in May 1997, as rebel forces closed in on the capital, Kinshasa, Mobutu retreated to his opulent palace in Gbadolite, his birthplace, which he had transformed into a surreal symbol of his wealth. From golden chandeliers to imported champagne, Gbadolite was known as the Versailles of the jungle. But even in this fortress of excess, Mobutu found no safety. His army had grown restless. Soldiers who once worshipped him as an untouchable leader now turned their guns toward his own aircraft. When Mobutu attempted to flee on a cargo plane, his mutinous troops opened fire on it, signaling the ultimate betrayal. A man who had prided himself on his command over Zaire's forces now realized he could not even trust his own men. Barely escaping with his family and a handful of loyal aides, Mobutu fled into the night. That escape marked the beginning of his exile, an exile filled with humiliation, rejection, and despair. The humiliation of exile. Mobutu's first stop was Togo, where he believed his fellow strongman, Gnassingbé Eyadema, would offer him sanctuary. But Eyadema quickly grew uneasy about hosting the fallen giant. Within days, Mobutu and his entourage were asked to leave. France, his longtime ally that had supported him until the last breath of his rule, also turned him away. It was a painful slap in the face. Paris, the city where he had invested millions and paraded as a celebrated guest, closed its doors. For a man who once dined with presidents and kings, the exile quickly turned into a tour of rejection. His power evaporated, his wealth was frozen, and his health deteriorated. He was no longer the father of Zaire, he was a sick man drifting from one unwilling host to another. Finally, Morocco accepted him. King Hossein II, with whom Mobutu shared a personal bond, allowed him to settle in Rabat. There, the once mighty ruler lived out his final months, not in the glitter of his jungle palaces, but in the sterile walls of hospitals, tethered to treatments for his aggressive prostate cancer, the lonely death of a king. By September 1997, Mobutu's condition worsened. Surrounded by his wife, Babi Ladewa, and his children, including his son Kongolo, he slipped closer to death. The man who once declared that he would only be known as the late president, never the former president, now faced the inevitable reality. He was 66 years old. Death came quietly in Rabat. There were no parades, no national mourning in Zaire, and no triumphant farewell. Instead, he died as an exile, cut off from the land he once ruled with an iron fist. His death marked the end of an era of Cold War dictators who rose to power not because of the will of their people, but because of geopolitical convenience. Mobutuism, pride and betrayal. Mobutu's legacy remains one of contradiction. Under his ideology of authenticity, later branded as Mobutuism, he encouraged Zairians to abandon colonial names, adopt African dress, and reclaim their heritage. It was a vision of cultural pride, but one stained with hypocrisy. For while he preached authenticity, he siphoned billions of dollars into foreign bank accounts, lived lavishly on European estates, and courted Western elites. He turned Zaire into a one-party state where dissent was crushed and loyalty was rewarded with patronage. His cult of personality became legendary. Schools taught children songs about him, his portrait adorned every public building, and he was addressed as the all-powerful warrior who goes from conquest to conquest. But beneath the glitter lay poverty, hunger, and repression. Roads crumbled, hospitals lacked medicine, and schools collapsed, even as Mobutu's personal fortune was estimated in the billions. By the time of his fall, Zaire had become a hollow shell of a state, its institutions rotted by corruption, a country in ruins. Mobutu often boasted that before him there was no Zaire, and that after him, Zaire would not survive. In a chilling twist of fate, his prediction partly came true. Within hours of his escape, Laurent Desire Kabila marched into Kinshasa and declared himself president. His first act was to erase Mobutu's most visible legacy, renaming the country back to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The leopard-skin cap was gone. The golden cane was gone. The name Zaire itself was gone. What remained was a country devastated by decades of misrule, corruption, and civil war. Mobutu may have left the stage, but the chaos he sowed outlived him, haunting Congo for decades to come. Reflections in Exile. In his final days, Mobutu reportedly reflected on his life with a mix of pride and despair. He saw himself as a man who gave his country an identity, who protected it from communism, and who stood as a symbol of strength. Yet, he also knew that his rule had left scars too deep to ignore. He had watched the palaces he built fall into the hands of rebels. He had seen the nation he renamed stripped of its borrowed title. He had felt the sting of betrayal from allies who abandoned him when he was no longer useful, and perhaps, most painfully, he had to confront the truth that while he lived in opulence, his people suffered. That contradiction weighed heavily on him in exile. The last words, "I am crying for my country," on his deathbed in Rabat, as his breathing grew shallow. Mobutu is said to have whispered words that revealed his deepest sorrow, "I am crying for my country." These words were not the boastful declarations of the leopard king, and not the triumphant cries of a man who once stood at the center of world politics. They were the quiet admission of a ruler who realized too late that power is fleeting, that wealth cannot buy legacy, and that history remembers not the palaces you build, but the nation you leave behind. Epilogue. Mobutu Sese Seko's life was a grand stage play, filled with spectacle, drama, betrayal, and tragedy. He rose from a humble army officer to become one of Africa's most notorious rulers. He courted kings and presidents, lived like royalty, and commanded the loyalty of millions. Yet, in the end, he died a man in exile, rejected by the world, and mourned by few. His story remains a cautionary tale of how unchecked power, corruption, and hubris can destroy both a man and a nation. Today, when one looks at the Democratic Republic of the Congo, still grappling with instability and conflict, Mobutu's ghost lingers. His final words, "I am crying for my country," echo not just as the lament of a fallen ruler, but as a haunting reminder of the cost of failed leadership.